the history of the newspaper back a lot farther than that, but this is the period that we claim for the joining of the Post and the Standard into the Post Standard, and that happened, of course, more than 100 years ago. These two people were colleagues. The other collaborator in the series was T. Elmer Bogardus, and that name should mean something to some of you because Bo, as he was called, was an important figure in the Syracuse community for a number of years. Not only as a newspaper person, a journalist, but also as a force in local, particularly Syracuse politics. And he is, I guess his legacy, if you'd agree with this, Barbara, is the what is now known as the Eagle newspaper chain, which is an awful lot bigger than it was when Elmer Bogardus was in charge. But he's the guy who started it. And that would be after he was a Post-Standard reporter. Now his collaborator, as I said, was Elizabeth Stamp. You will see her byline in this collection as being Elizabeth Pike. And in a few minutes I'll explain to you why. Elizabeth Stamp was her married name. I stumbled across these articles as probably either clippings or photocopies in newspaper files for a number of years. But my start on kind of exploring this whole series of articles, which turned out to be 40 total over 1933 and 34, was back home when I was growing up in Marcellus. In the bottom drawer of a dresser in our den was all of what amounted at that point to our family history. What it was kind of a haphazard collection of old pictures, scrapbooks, and a lot of miscellaneous material. And one of the articles that I used to look at, and I don't know how many times as a kid that I did, was the Lost Village article about K-Town. Anybody know where K-Town was? Yeah, you're right. There was a family, lowercase settlement there, but the one I'm talking about was in the other part of the county, and it's now called Holland Hill. Somewhere along the line, the cases were shoved aside and the Hollows took over. And it was probably when there was a post office put in the community. But that particular clipping, and I've got a copy of it here, a photocopy, was something that was kind of in the back of my mind for a number of years. And I later put it in a secure folder and kept it as part of our history. K-Town was founded by my ancestors in the very early 1800s. My great whatever grandfather was Giles Case, and he was a Revolutionary War soldier who was drafted when he lived in Connecticut, and he served several turns as a revolutionary soldier, coming home and then going back to the front, various places. And he did at one point serve at West Point in New York. Now, there probably are people here who know more about the military tract than I do, but his home, the homestead of the Cases in New York State, is in the town of Onondaga, approximately where Howlett Hill and Casson Roads cross. And how he got that land, I don't know. He's certainly not listed among those who were given military lots in the town. So my guess from talking to people who know more about this than I do is that he bought it from a speculator. And the original soldier who had the title gave it up, probably sold it. Giles was from a family in Connecticut, and we're told, I don't know how accurate it is, that all the Cases in the United States at this point descended from two brothers who came over from England in the 1600s. Giles came from a little town in western Connecticut called Simsbury. A few weeks ago, my wife and I spent some time in Simsbury kind of kicking around in the local historical society and going to the cemetery where we found the grave, and it's supposedly the oldest one there, of one of the wives of our ancestor John Case. So that's where Casetown came from. There were two Revolutionary War soldiers who settled side by side in the town of Onondaga. One was my ancestor, and the other was a guy named Thomas Robinson. And Thomas was a Massachusetts soldier who supposedly had been at Bunker Hill. So these two guys, who probably didn't know each other until they got there, settled down side by side at adjoining farms. Both houses, the Case family house and the Robinson house, are still there. The Cases fled to all different places, including the village of Marcellus, where I grew up. And the Robinson family has, even though they sold the homestead, there is still a Robinson descendant living on that original farm. And we, from time to time, we do have a family reunion up there. So that's my connection to this book, which came quite a while ago. When I got to be more of a student of history than I was way back then, I started finding these Lost Village articles. And I don't know where the thought came from or the original encouragement, but it almost became a project with me to somehow track all of the original articles down and collect them into a book, because as I read through them, I was fascinated with the material that these two reporters maybe inadvertently had preserved about these communities. The title village is totally inaccurate here. None of them were villages. They were what we would call today hamlet, and which I guess is what Fabius is?
Village.
No, it is a village, okay. So let's say Apulia Station. Yeah. It's at that level an unincorporated community. Some of them were extremely small. Most of them were extremely small, but some miraculously have survived, at least with that name that they had originally. Probably the ones you would remember easily would be Manley Center, the High Bridge, which apparently earlier was called Elkhorn for some reason. Woodchuck Hill, was a thriving little settlement. Now it's kind of not much more than a very busy suburban area, and the road survives, and that's, I guess, how some of those names are preserved. But the main reason for these settlements was when they were settled is a matter of time and distance. And the communities in the days of the horse and the wagon were just far enough apart, so there was space in between them to establish, usually in no particular order, a church, a school, and a store. And we're told that all of these little communities had those in the very beginning. Today, it's pretty much the name, or even in some cases the tradition, that the name has been kept by a few people who remember it. And that was one of the things that appealed to me when I decided I'd like to put this together, is that maybe in another generation, all those old names would have been completely forgotten, unless they're on a road sign or, in very few cases, on a post office. They might have completely disappeared. You can go through and look at the old New York State topographical maps and find these places and many others. But when you get in your car and drive there, and I'm sure Gordon D'Angelo can testify to this, you kind of look around and wonder, where am I? Because there's really not much there. There may be an old church that's now an auto garage. There may be a schoolhouse that is now somebody's house. There may be an old graveyard that's completely overgrown and neglected, except of course in Nancy Edwards territory. That doesn't happen. But there are reminders, and I think that appealed to me that this collection of stories was a good way of preserving those. So what I did was, at some point, it was probably 4 or 5 years before the book actually was published, I started working to collect these, and most of the time the original articles existed only as microfilm. In some cases, in various collections, I would find a kind of a grainy photocopy. But eventually, starting with a very excellent collection that belonged to, I would call this woman one of my silent collaborators. This name may be familiar to you. Florence Brock, at one time, was the town of Skaneatel's historian, and I can't remember now what the circumstances were, but somehow I had a chance to meet her, and we started talking about these, and she said, "Oh yes, I have collected quite a few of those myself." So with her material from the Onondaga Historical Association and other places, I was able to get what I'm confident at this point, that nobody's challenged us, is a complete set of the original articles that at least were about places in Onondaga County. Now the book has a few interesting side paths. I think when I really decided I was going to do this, I was up on Wellesley Island on the river to do a story about a woman who had just written a memoir about her little summer community up there. And I want to make sure I get it right. It's called Grandview, if any of you are familiar with the island. Apparently it's a colony of like-minded families who had been there for a number of years, and the camps have passed down through generations. But in 1988, the former Elizabeth Pike. Now, Elizabeth Stamp, at that point, the widow of a Methodist minister, was the author. And without knowing too much more, except that she had lived in Syracuse and had worked at the Post-Standard, I hiked up to Wellesley Island and spent the better part of the day talking to Elizabeth and I think having lunch or something like that at her camp. And I didn't know that I was, for a while, that I was talking to Elizabeth Pike. But we came to a point where I asked her some of the things, we started talking about the Post-Standard, and she said that she had once written a series of articles called The Lost Villages of Onondaga County. And I said, oh my gosh, I know all about that. What was your name back then? And she said Elizabeth Pike. And it did more than ring a bell, because the reporter who had written the original story that I had looked at as a kid was Elizabeth Pike. She wrote the particular article about K-Town. So we kind of established a bond. And being, at that time I was still working for the Herald Journal, but since we were all one happy family, I considered her a former colleague. This is a little bit of a digression, but I think the women in the audience will enjoy it. I said, you're only at the Post-Standard a relatively short time. She said, yes, but I was the only woman who was a hard news, what we call in business a city desk reporter. And she wanted to make sure I knew that she didn't work in the ladies department, as she called it. A department which has vanished in the newspaper business, by the way. And then she proceeded to tell me the story about how she had met, I think his name was Lloyd Stamp, the minister. He was on the staff of Hendricks Chapel at SU. They fell in love and they decided to get married. So one day she confronts her boss with the news just to find out if he had any objections. Now, of course, she was looking around the room and all she could see, except in their little cage in the corner, was a desk filled by men. And she talked to the man and asked him if he had any problem with her getting married. And he said no. So she got married. And she came back to the office after her honeymoon. And I don't know how much time passed, but not very long apparently, as I remember the story. And the same man called her into the office and he said, I'm sorry to tell you this, but we're going to have to let you go. And she asked him why. And she said, well, there are men married with families who need this job more than you do. And you're a woman and you're married and you don't need to work. In effect, those might not have been his exact words. So that was the end of Elizabeth's newspaper career. She never went back to the business. She followed her husband around to a series of appointments in the church, and at the time that I met her, she was living in the state of Washington. Her husband had passed away. And I told her that day that I'd always been thinking about putting together this collection, and she thought that was a great idea. And we exchanged a little information about how she did it. It's interesting when and if you read some of these, you will see a little bit of backstage chatter in the stories themselves about how she would drive out into the country with a photographer, and they would try to find somebody who had some information on the place, and some people were helpful and other people thought they were nuts. And she did tell me one interesting thing that I also connected to, and that was that the photographer who traveled with her very often and took some great pictures, which are lost, except on microfilm or photocopy. A fellow named Herman Borsner, who, when I was a copy boy at the Post Standard in college, Herman was the Post Standard's chief photographer. And and I was a copy boy, remember, so I never went out on assignment with Herman. But just from his demeanor, I kind of felt sorry for Elizabeth. I hope he had changed over the years. He was a very mean guy. And I could imagine being trapped in a car with him somewhere down near Gooseville. But again, there was a connection. So I left Wellesley Island that day with a firm thought in mind that this is something that we had to do. And I was able to easily talk the folks at the Post Standard to allowing me to do the collection and to act as a publisher, which we had been doing a little bit of publishing books at the Post during that period. We've since stopped. We have enough of a challenge getting a newspaper out every day. But the book was published, and with a lot of help from Barbara Vett, who also, knowing Elmer Bogardus as she did, she worked for Bo, was very encouraging that this was a job that needed to get done. So we put it out. We made almost no changes in the original text. There were a couple of odd spellings, colloquial for the 30s. The only one I remember right now was through, T-H-O-U, instead of the real word. And that apparently was just part of a reform that never got off the ground to shorten the English language. Which is, when you think about it, a thankless job. But there was one error, in fact, and I won't blame either one of them. I don't know which one of them had made it, but there is a place in Onondaga County, believe it or not, called Satan's Kingdom, and that's in the book. It's out Camillus Way. Yeah. It's not too far from California, which is also near Georgia. You're also not going to believe this. There apparently at one time were two Satan's kingdoms in Onondaga County. The other was in the town of Manlius. Am I right, Barbara? And I think it was with Barbara's help that we were able to correct that, because the whoever wrote that particular story had put Satan's Kingdom that she was writing about, I think it was Elizabeth, in the town of Manlius rather than where it traditionally is. And if you go there today, it's out in the general area of Bennett's Corners. You will see the Satan's Kingdom Cemetery. And can you imagine telling your relatives that you want to be buried in Satan's Kingdom Cemetery? But it's a large and very well-kept cemetery. Those relatively few examples were the only ones that we had to change. And the information, even at this now great distance, I think kind of sparkles across the years, because it was the kind of thing that I suppose a professional would call folklore, although these were two journalists. They weren't collecting folklore. They were trying to put a story together. And I remember Elizabeth telling me about how she would come back from being in a particular place, Hardscrabble or Dutch Hill or one of the other places, and go over to the old public library on Montgomery Street and try to find out as much background. But you will notice that if you read these, is that the reporter ends up kind of shrugging her shoulders, his shoulders, and saying, well, I really couldn't find any proof of the story, but here it is. And I think that even though I'm sure it wasn't their idea, I'm sure their mission was to come up with a Sunday story that the boss had decided would be interesting. And these stories did run in the Sunday paper. And their mission was not to preserve history or collect folklore. Their idea was to write a weekly feature story. But the truth is that that's exactly what they did, and which made putting this together, I think, after a while became a little bit of a mission for me. As I said, none of the photographs, which I brought some photocopies of the three places in Fabius that are in the book, just to show you what the photography was like. Unfortunately, it's gone. So the best we can do is we're able to reproduce, because of the modern digital printing, we're able to reproduce a couple of the photocopies. And the book itself has a few original illustrations that were done by the publisher, who is an interesting story in herself. Her name is Trudy Eiler, Gertrude Eiler. And Trudy, for a number of years, ran a very small publishing company in her basement in the outer Comstock area of Syracuse. And Trudy came from an old Syracuse family. Her parents and I guess maybe grandparents were the folks who ran Iroquois Publishing, which was a very successful, I guess you could say, school book publisher for a number of years. I believe it, and the company was sold to one of the larger publishers. It might have been Macmillan in the 1940s. So Trudy, in a way, grew up in a publishing family, but that wasn't what she made her living at. She became an expert stenographer, and that's really how she got started putting these projects together. So it's we have an interesting collaboration of people on this project. Her press was called Pine Tree Press. It still exists. She eventually sold it to a woman who was a colleague, and I think it's still called Pine Tree Press. And the specialty is publishing family histories, and they have done many of them. And it's a kind of a project that they like to take on. If you have a family history you'd like to have published, and published almost in quotes, because they will print as many copies as you need. And if you need more, they'll print some more. But it's a relatively inexpensive way of getting the material you want in print and, bottom line, preserved. And if anybody ever wants to inquire further, I think you can call me and tell me I'm wrong. The phone number is in the phone book. And it's still, the press is still being carried on, even though Trudy, at the age of 90-something, has finally retired. So that's how this came together. I'm sorry we don't have any of the original photographs, because you can see even from these photocopies that photography is almost as interesting as the text in some cases. The three places in your town that are in the book, and you probably don't, you can make an excellent guess of what they are. One is Gooseville, and there's a great picture of the two settlers who were there, the Beach Sisters, am I right? Alma and Candace. And then, of course, there's a picture of the cemetery and the beach homestead. That's one. The second one is Kenny Settlement. Am I pronouncing it right, or are they pronouncing Kinney? Kinney. That was the second. And the third, Nancy? Carter's Mills.
Oh, really?
Carter's Mills, yes.
Oh, right.
Yep, which is
Right
site
on
of
the
the...
edge, right on the edge of the town of Concord.
Mm-hmm. I think we put in Fabius. Did we do the right thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the box, the cheese box. I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen these.
Yes,
But,
I have. Yes.
Nancy's home is the former Maxwell.
Right, except that's actually in the town of Pompey, so that's confusing because that was Maxwell Mills, but that's what they have pictured.
Well, you see, when they established these settlements, nobody cared about town lines. They were more interested in putting down the roots and starting a community, which is, I think, what you will see reflected here. If you're interested, I can just read for you some of the other places that are included in the book, and see if you know where they are. Here's one of my favorites, and it's one that even though I grew up in the town of Marcellus, where this was, I'd never heard of Bumblebee City until I started pulling together these articles, but Bumblebee City's closest neighbor was Navarino, which apparently was also called Hall's Corners at one point. I have to make a startling admission here, and it's totally accidental, but this series included not only a profile of Casetown in the town of Onondaga, but the settlement of Case, which is in the town of Atisco, and it's the area on top of the hill directly up from Route 20 where Hitchings Farm, I guess, used to be. And it's also referred to up there as a Case settlement. But that was strictly an accident of not my selection, but the originators. Another interesting one that I did know about was a community that, if you pronounced it the way it's spelled, you'd call it Joshua. But one of the experiences I had, because I went out when I started this and tried to find each of these places. And believe me, I had as difficult a time as Elizabeth Pike and Elmer Bogardus did finding them, because they're even better hidden now than they were all those years ago. But Joshua is on Route 20, maybe a mile east of Navarino. So I had a pretty good idea because of the picture we have shows his house right at the corner of what they call the Hogsback. And there was no one there, so I went across the street and there was this cute little house perched on the hill. I knocked on the door, and I told the woman who answered the door that I was looking for Joshua, and she looked at me as if I had said something terrible about her mother. And she said, "It's Joshua." And the biblical pronunciation. And I later heard a real old timer in the village of Marcellus who knew about the place call it Joshua. So I knew that was what it should be. I had a similar experience. We were talking before about the settlement of California, which is on the Erie Canal, east of Jordan. And I walked down there looking for any signs of life, and I did knock on a door there, and I asked the woman, told her I was looking for California, which is kind of a stupid thing, isn't it? And she looked at me, and she said, and she was smiling in this case, she said, "This is it." She said it was pretty much around the 2 or 3 houses that I was looking at the moment. Oswego Bitter, Shamrock. Oswego Bitter is in the town of Camillus, and it's not far from Satan's Kingdom, actually. Shepherd Settlement, which is in the town of Skaneateles, but very close to Marcellus. The little hamlet, not the town, the hamlet of Spafford. Thornhill. Anybody know where Thornhill is? Thornhill is just down the road a piece from Rose Hill, right? But it's not as logical as you might think. Rose Hill was named because the Mill Seed Company was located there, and they grew flower after flower from the seeds, and a very successful seed business. But Thornhill is on the same road, but maybe less than a mile away. And Thornhill was actually named for the Thorn family. And there is to this day a little church there that the family has a huge farm nearby, and is the Thornhill Church and not the Rose Hill Church. And so you run into kind of those little quirks. Here's one that really surprised me, and I'd never heard of this, and it's almost impossible to find it. A place called Zealand, as in New Zealand, but this is the original Zealand that they named the other place for, I'm sure. It's in the town of Atisco, in the general area of Amber. My one completely unsuccessful excursion when I was getting ready to do this was to Picketville, which is in Lysander. It would be hard to explain any closer landmark, the settlement of Jacksonville, which is also out that way. If anybody ever goes to the Brostick auctions, it's down that road. But I lucked out. I was introduced to a man who lived close by, and I asked him if he ever heard of Picketville, and he said, sure. My father took me to see Picketville when I was a kid, and I said, where is it? And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll take you there. So one day I got him out there, and I couldn't even tell you exactly where we were, but in the general area of the hamlet of Jacksonville. And we parked, and he said it's a little bit of a hike. It really wasn't a terrific hike, but it was maybe a half a mile from the road. We walked up a farm road and down into the woods. And after we got into the woods, which was kind of swampy, we walked to a very thick, moist place in the middle of the woods, and jumped over some logs, and there he said, there's Picketville. And what Picketville was, and it still is, was a basement, a cellar hole of the kind that Red France loves. Up the road to Kenyon Hollow, right? But that's all there was left of Picketville, and I think if it wasn't for that guy showing me where it was, that I never would have found it. But that's the kind of place we're talking about. This was a little place that had a factory that made pickets.
Was it on the street?
Yes, it was, and the stream was very small, but at that point we were there, it had flooded, so we were talking about kind of a marshy area, but hidden away in the woods. And I asked this guy if he wanted to put a historic marker there someday, and he said, well, we'd think about it. But I'm not sure he did, but I think this book is we're probably going to have to do for a historic marker for Picketville and a lot of the other places that my colleagues collected all those years ago. That's my story. Does anybody want to ask a question?
When they were talking about Keeney settlement, was there any mention of Wilson's Heaven?
Wilson's
Heaven.
That doesn't jump out at me, Gordon. I'm not sure.
And it's supposed to be that at the north end of Keeney settlement, where down in the valley, there's the back end of the ski area, that great big ski. That was Wilson's Heaven, but they never told me anything else.
Brad, does that ring any bells with you?
No.
Well, who's this guy Wilson? Is he the guy that named that Arab Hill? If I was doing this book, I would have put Arab Hill.
By the way, they had so many problems back in the early 40s. Using whole name, because they changed it all to just the kingdom.
Yes.
My brother and sister went to school at Georgia.
Oh, is that right?
They had friends in the kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah. That's did you hear what she said that the name was shortened to the kingdom versus Satan's kingdom? So the stigma remains hidden in the pages of history, I guess. And along with the reason that they called it that. Barbara?
Well, I was just going to say, when you go out there, the school is on one side, the cemetery is on the other, and the third corner is the only house still in the picture. So it's on the corner of Kingdom Road. Everybody out there knows it's Satan's Kingdom.
That reminds me of something when I had to do the exploring out there, and I had a local guide, the fellow who looks after the cemetery there, and he took me over and introduced me to a woman who, as a child, had her picture included in the series, and she is in the picture that ran, one of the pictures that ran with the Satan's Kingdom article. So that was another kind of interesting connection that we made. Any other questions? I was asked to bring some of the books with me, and I did. And if you're willing to part with $20, even, I'll be happy to sell you one. That price we arrived at after doing this a few times. This has got to be the longest book signing tour that ever existed. It started back in '99. And in time we ran out of books, and they were reprinted last year. So we have a new stock, and I guess I'm back on the road again. Whatever the difference is between lumping in the sales tax and the money that the publisher of the Post-Annual wants to make on the book, there will be a difference, and we'll return it to the treasury of the Historical Society, probably in 4 or 5 years. No, we will. Yes.
An 82-year-old lady lives almost across the road that worked with the Bill's Seed House as a late teens.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, the Mill Seed Company, which is not in the book, Thornhill won out, but is a very interesting story. And if any of you are familiar with that area, it's on the road that runs from Route 20 to Hamlet of Bordina, about halfway along. But the granddaughter of Frank Mills, who founded the seed company, still lives in his house. And some of the original buildings are still there. Some of them are gone. But it was an active company up into what? Maybe, yeah. I think that she told me that they kind of wound down during World War II and never went back. But they would, in a typical year, they would send out thousands of seed catalogs, and that was one of the main jobs of people. And I don't know what your friend did, but one of the jobs was to come in February and March and start sending those out. The job the season before was to fill seed packets, and they had their own post office. They had a large building that's still there. They called the Seed House. Across the road was a huge, I think it's about 4 stories high, boarding house where the workers lived. That's still there. The post office, interestingly enough, when it closed, and it was open into my childhood because my dad knew the Mills family. The post office was bought by a man who was at a summer camp on Skaneateles Lake and knew the place very well. And he has moved it into his business in Syracuse, a printing company that's now, after I've told you this, I'm not going to remember the name of the company, but it's on West Onondaga Street. It's very close to where Midland comes into West Onondaga Street by the funeral home. And pardon me? Yes, thank you. Yeah, and he has a little post office all set up with a whole bunch of seed company memorabilia, seed packets, catalogs. It's really neat, and you can just walk into the lobby and there it is if you ever want to check it out. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for inviting me.
Folks, we've got some refreshments over here. Give you a chance to talk.
Nice to see you. It's great you can